Now, before we start, let me introduce some event rules. With many participants, including young people joining from across the globe today, we want the webinar to be an informative and interactive process where we support to amplify youth voices and actions. With this in mind, please feel free to use the Q&A function to bring any questions and comments to the presenters and panelists throughout the webinar. Your mics will be put on mute, but will be open during the Q&A sections. We will do our best to bring them to their attention as we go. Also, please let us know if you have any questions that you would like to ask the panelists live. There will also be an opportunity to do so, in which case, please be ready to present, speak up, and state your name and country. Now, as we start this exciting event, we also invite you to participate in our Zoom polls, which are happening throughout the webinar. The first poll is up on demographics. So this is going to be a great poll to learn a little bit more about each other. I'll just give you a few seconds to complete the poll before we continue. Great. So as you do that, it is my pleasure to introduce Susana Poito from the ILO. Susana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Cici. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I will share my screen now. Oh, host, can you allow me to share my screen, please? In the meantime, I'll just continue. So there we go. Let me know. Okay, so let me first start by saying that in March, when we started seeing the coronavirus translating into a pandemic and very quickly into an economic crisis, our minds quickly went back to 2008, when was the last time we witnessed how an economic crisis impacted drastically the lives of young people. The only difference is that we just didn't cut it correctly, because this crisis, in difference to the last one, is much more dramatic in the sense that it brings shocks both on the supply and the demand side. So understanding the impact of the pandemic on young people became our priority and very much the focus of our work at the ILO. So, and it's one of the reasons why we started working towards a survey, online survey, to help us understand and capture the voices of young people, their perceptions and aspirations as regards to the crisis. So this work will not have been possible without the support of amazing partners, and let me just quickly recognize their collaboration, their support in the drafting of the survey and the analysis. So for this survey, we worked together with the UN Mayor Group for Children and Youth, ISEC, the European Youth Forum, the European Commission Trust Fund for Africa, and the Office of the High Level Commissioner for Human Rights. These partners were key for us to conduct the survey and to reach out to many thousands of young people. Now, it is also important to recognize the partners of the Global Initiative on Decent Jobs for Youth, who help us get the word out and have already helped us greatly with the dissemination of the results. So thank you very much to everyone who supported this effort. I will say it is important to understand what is the impact, because we can then create some recommendations for policy making and decision making, and it's critical to bring the voices of young people into those spaces. So now let me quickly jump into with some information about the survey. We ran the survey between 21 of April and 21 of May. As I said before, this was a time when the pandemic was advancing rapidly, and the economic effects were being felt all over the globe. So when we started running the survey, there were about, without all the caveats around cases, but let's talk about the number of deaths. There were about 172,000 deaths, and when we closed it, it had already go up to 327,000. So we were, let's say the survey came at a time where young people and everybody in our societies were really feeling the heat of the crisis. And of course, not that we have more certainty today, but those were times of great uncertainty. It is also important to note that 9 out of 10 respondents to the survey were living in countries with workplace closures in at least some sectors. This is crucial because many of the young people that took the survey were already impacted by closures of schools, by closures of economic activity, and their situation and their realities are naturally reflected in their responses. So, in this context, the survey captured the voices of 12,600 respondents between the ages of 18 to 34. When we look at what are the impacts on young people, we are very much focusing on the age range 18 to 29. And as you know, even though the youth definition starts with 15 years old, we decided to focus on 18 and above, just to keep the survey flowing and allowing us to capture the voices of young people without requiring parental consent. So we got responses from 112 countries. These countries are primarily high-income countries and middle-income countries. I should point that one of the caveats of our survey is that being an online survey, we didn't capture a lot of voices of young people in lower income countries. So it is an important caveat to note, and that leads to the fact that the survey population is representative of young students and young workers with higher levels of education, specifically tertiary education. So with all this in mind, let me just pass the word to Cici to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Susanna. Let's move to the first of our thematic discussions on the employment impacts of COVID-19 on young people. Drew Gardner from the ILO will walk us through the main findings of the survey as regards to employment. So over to you, Drew.
Great. Thank you very much, Cici and Susanna, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the young people, ILO colleagues and others that are joining and to our survey partners. And pleasure to be here with you this morning. So we looked at many different issues in this survey, but I think one of the most important, at least for us at ILO, was the effect of the pandemic on youth employment and labor markets. And the main indicator that we looked at was a variable which we called stopped working. So actually we found that 1 in 6 young people that we surveyed had stopped working as a result of the crisis. So that's saying that they lost their job during the survey period when the pandemic was in full run. And we did find that more vulnerable occupations were affected by the pandemic, and young people in those occupations. So those that were in sales jobs, in service jobs. So there was a higher impact on those types of occupations, and actually around a 10% higher job stopped working effect amongst those occupations. And actually, the younger you are, the more you are affected, the more your employment situation has been affected by the pandemic. So in fact, amongst those between 18 and 24 years of age, impacts are greater. So actually 23% have stopped working versus those that are between 30 and 34, the number is around 11%. So it's over twice those that have stopped working. Working hours have also decreased, and for the ILO, this is one of the main indicators that we use to measure labor market impacts is working hours. So we did find that young people on average working hours decreased by around a quarter. So if you think about an 8-hour workday, young people are working 2 hours less per day. 2 out of 5 of those young workers have also experienced a reduction in income. And 3 out of 5 have reported decreases in productivity. And that has a lot to do with also your workplace. So whether you're able to effectively work at home or in another location, or if you didn't really have a safe, secure, and productive area to work in. So Cece, I'll leave it there and I'll pass it back to you, and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. So let me bring in our first panelists today, Betty and Sarah. Welcome both. So I might start off with you, Betty. Drew has sort of painted a picture about the severe impacts of the pandemic, especially on young workers. So as a young person yourself, how have you and other young people in your community, in your constituency, do you feel sort of have felt these employment shocks? Do these results sort of resonate well with your experience and the experience of those around you?
Absolutely. Thanks, Sissy. And thank you, Drew, for highlighting the key findings. I'd like to begin by saying that the job market for young people was, as it is, pretty bad to start off with. Young people were struggling to enter these spaces and sustain their place within these spaces. And as with most other things, this pandemic has shaken and increased existing inequalities and reinforced those on the margins to remain on the margins, if not push them further. And the young people have always been on the margins of this. So younger women and people with disabilities and gender diverse people have been pushed further into the margins of the pandemic impacts. As the findings have also shown, I think the younger you are, the newer you are it's easier to let you go more quickly, which is unfortunate because it speaks about our commitment to the young people in a holistic way. The other thing I would like to bring to attention is the gendered aspect of it. Young women and with people of gender diverse background have constantly faced a higher challenge of being, sustained in these spaces and constantly fighting for like a living wage, a minimum living wage. And so it's been extremely difficult to sustain that. A rapid assessment by ILO in the Pacific showed that 26% of the workers that were let go in Samoa because of the pandemic, and this is after the measles outbreak and after coronavirus hit, 64% were women, and these sort of statistics are across the globe. And I'm bringing in a Pacific perspective. The other thing that's also critical to note here is the pandemic is also a multiplier of existing threats. So in the Pacific, climate change had always been an issue of health, economic, and social boundaries. What this has done is exacerbated these existing issues. And the rates of sexual and gender-based violence have also gone up, limiting people's abilities to stay in the employment in the workforce as hard as it is in current times. So it's also important to know that you can't lock down the patriarchy, you can't lock down climate change. And this is something that young people have been facing. What the pandemic has done is really amplified our situation and definitely made it worse. So the findings are coherent to our experiences currently.
Great, thank you so much, Betty. And I think, especially when you talked about COVID-19 amplifying and exacerbating some of the existing shocks that young people face, and sort of talking about your experience in the Pacific, I think is really noteworthy. And what you find is during these shocks, young people are often the most vulnerable, and this is what we see here with COVID-19 as well. So let me also just bring in Sarah to the conversation. So Sarah, Betty has painted a very tangible picture of the challenges young people are facing. From your perspective, how can we tackle it from a policy perspective? What solutions are there for government, social partners, private sector, and other actors committed to addressing this challenge?
Great. Thank you, Sissy. And let me start by congratulating the ILO and all of its great partners for putting out.
I think we may have lost Sarah to poor internet connection. So if that's okay, let me just bring Betty sort of into the conversation again and ask the same question. So we've sort of validated a lot of the results that we've seen with the report. As a young person, what changes would you like to see from your governments? What changes would you like to see from civil society to help? Oh, I think we're back. No, so I'll go straight ahead with you first, Betty. So over to you.
Yes, absolutely. I think there have been definite opportunities that have come as a result of the pandemic, and this has shown the increased care burden, obviously. But what can be solutions to this is recognizing that, you know, there are other non-financial obligations that can be met by governments and civil society organizations. So, say, for example, the provision of childcare makes a huge difference for young mothers who are struggling to make ends meet. The provision and coverage of psychosocial support for young people, but also for migrant workers in countries where these services are reliant upon. I think it's also very evident that 50% of the young people that responded to the survey said they struggled with mental health, and I think this sort of coverage makes a difference.
Exactly. And that's definitely something that we will talk into sort of the next panel as well. So we also have Sarah back. So over to you on what we can do to tackle these challenges.
Okay, so bravo to you for your flexibility on the technological front. It shows how creative and flexible we all are and adept at dealing with these technological glitches. So I'm not sure if you heard any of my response. Let me start by congratulating the panelists on the report and for bringing together this event today. And let me just jump into the question, to which I have to unfortunately state the obvious, which is, of course, there's no one solution that's going to help us address all of the challenges that have been raised, all of these very difficult times that young people are facing right now. But when it comes to supporting young people in their transitioning from school to work, helping them to get jobs and to keep jobs, we have to remember that most of the actions that were being taken already before the current crisis still remain valid and could and should be scaled up. So Betty mentioned already that the current the current crisis facing young people is not really new. Young people have always remained on the margin. Of course, their challenges are exacerbated right now. But what this means is the tools that were already in our tool belt and being implemented by governments, by NGOs, by the private sector, or any combination of these to support youth entrepreneurship, to train people, upskill young people in various sectors, apprenticeship programs, youth-targeted employment subsidies, financial inclusion programs. Of course, all of these remain relevant. And I'm sure that these are some solution areas that will continue to attract donor funding during the crisis period. But beyond the old solutions, there are also now what we can call the extraordinary measures that are being taken by governments in response to COVID-19 in their response packages. So we know that most governments are heroically taking actions that are geared towards keeping enterprises afloat and supporting workers. And now these are not specifically targeted to young people. However, young people remain as beneficiaries. So you have a youth-led small and medium enterprise, for example, should be able to tap in to the government supported business loans. They should be able to benefit from the wage subsidy policies if a country has one. Many countries are providing social assistance to persons, including young people who've lost their livelihoods during the lockdown periods. All of these are important measures that are helping millions of enterprises and workers through the crisis. But of course, the big question remains as to how long governments can sustain the level of fiscal expenditure that they're putting into these measures. And all countries in our region, Betty and I are both servicing the Asian Pacific region. So all countries in our region certainly need to think much more long-term about boosting their investment in social protection, including unemployment benefits, and spending more, not just during the crisis, but during also boom times, on active labor market policies that can help young people and adults to get back on their feet. Some countries are also inviting young people to the table to lend their voices in the forums that decide the COVID response measures. And I think this is, of course, an excellent practice that I would hope could be universal. We know that young people have great ideas. I read in our newspaper, our local newspaper, the Bangkok Post, just the other day, there was an op-ed by a young person who is, of course, urging the government to put jobs for youth higher on the agenda, and also to think outside of the box in doing so. And this person was suggesting that the government could offer young people short-term jobs in digitizing the billions of administrative documents that pile up in the government ministries. And I thought this was an excellent point, a very valid point, and what would be a great use of government funds. So thanks you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And I think what you said about that whole of government approach and youth as not just benefactors and beneficiaries of change, but also agents of change and working together. And I think this webinar is really a key example of us working together. And as we can see with the results of the first poll, where we have sort of a lot of young people from across the region, Asia Pacific, also sort of in Europe, but also looking at the range of people that are joining us, from students to people working in government to people in the UN and private sector. I think it's about having those conversations that are very much needed. So moving on, let me move to the Q&A and hear from our audience. So for our audience, please take this time, if you haven't done so already, to use the Q&A function to ask your questions. So while we are gathering the questions for Sarah and Betty, I also invite our audience to participate in our second poll on what policy measures you would prioritize to support the transition of young people into decent work. So as we are sort of gathering and I see sort of all the questions coming in, I'll just give you a few seconds to complete the poll and then we'll continue. Great. So Betty and Sarah, we've received quite a number of comments and questions. So let me bring sort of two to your attention. I will also invite Charles to pose his question live. So Charles, please be ready shortly and one of our hosts will turn on your mic for you. So Betty and Sarah, the first question is looking at youth groups that are highly disadvantaged in the labour market. So something, Betty, that you've touched on previously as well. So this question is pointed out by Stefan in the chat. So how can we also support youth with disabilities, youth in rural economies, and youth also affected by disasters? What are some ways in which we can support these young people and ensure we leave no one behind? The other question that we have is, what strategies do you think are best placed to tackle this pandemic and also prevent the further marginalization and also boost social inclusion? We also have Isaac here from Nigeria talking about how we can also help, you know, African countries, and also since this is a global pandemic and a global issue, what are some ways in which we can also support other regions? So I will now invite Charles to pose his question live to our panelists. Charles, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, and thank you very much. First of all, thanks very much for presenting these results. It's hugely interesting, and it's always really exciting to see such effort being placed on youth-focused research, surveys of this depth and rigor. So thank you very much indeed. So my quick question, oh sorry, I should mention that my name is Charles and I'm currently based in Brussels, Belgium, but I'm British. And I work for the youth NGO sector. So my first question is actually a two-part question, if that is okay. The first part is, what kind of impacts do you think COVID-19 will have looking forward on already polarizing gaps in skills development? And if you can, I would like that to focus on the digital divide. And the second part, if this isn't too long, what strategies do you think are best placed to tackle this? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. I'll head over to our panelists. In the interest of time, please feel free to pick sort of one or two questions and key points to touch on. So let's start with you, Betty, for your thoughts and insights.
Sure. Thanks, Sissy. And thank you to the attendees and Charles for the questions. I'll address the two around not leaving anyone behind and what structures and strategies to address. I think what the pandemic has made us realize is, particularly when it comes to people with disabilities and people in the rural areas, that working from home actually worked to their advantage. So there is an opportunity to integrate holistically and actually plan for it. And within the current work market, there is opportunities that we just had overlooked previously, you know. So now we know what is possible when people are pushed beyond limits. It's also very fascinating to see the very innovative approaches young people have taken up to actually not just sustain their small and medium enterprises, but to be a part of the workforce while also contributing their time and energy to other resources. In some cases, where possible, where accessibility to the digital space was accessible, they've upskilled during this lockdown. So this has been, you know, very contextually different for different people. In terms of the strategies, I think I particularly work closely with civil society organizations in the region. And what we've seen is a lot of the organizations that do a vast, various kinds of work have been pushed into crisis response mode. So everybody's responding to the crisis, making people's ends meet. And so what's really worked here is being able to provide a flexible core funding that they can sort of maximize to their own benefits and what they seem needed. This is a shift from traditional philanthropic methods, but it's what's working, because at this point in time, all other programmatic needs have been a halt. So that's what's working out.
Great, thank you so much, Betty. Over to you, Sarah. Do you echo some of Betty's sentiments? What are some of your thoughts around these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I can support what Betty has mentioned. What the crisis has done absolutely in our region is to really showcase the digital divide and to bring greater urgency to the political level in dealing with the digital divide. I mean, for us, it's became really evident when in the schooling front, in homeschooling. That's one area where it received a lot of political attention. The fact that only the wealthy schools are able to support online learning, the less wealthy schools are struggling, and the children don't have any means whatsoever, and so they are in fact being left behind. So the governments will step this up, and they already are. The schools in this region went back to online schooling, part-time online schooling, part-time face-to-face schooling in July, and in the month prior to July, there was a lot of scrambling to get these schools ready to make sure that all young people are able to benefit. So yes, in that regards, I'd say the crisis has highlighted an issue, a long-standing issue, and now forcing the hands of governments to put more money and more attention. So I think that's a positive development.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I really also want to highlight the results of our second poll, where we can I think really resonate with what you said previously, how it's not a one size fits all. It's a multitude of policies working together to ensure that young people are not left behind. So, and that's quite clearly demonstrated with sort of people voting in the poll. There's quite sort of an even split in what policy measures that we should really look into to help transition young people into decent work. So I think as we sort of near the end of this panel discussion, I'd like to sort of turn back to our panelists on your key takeaways. So for anyone who's watching around the globe, in a minute or less, what is your message to young workers and the millions of young people who are today trying to find a job or transition into decent work? I'll start with Sarah on this one first. So over to you, Sarah.
Great, thank you. My message to young people is be open and make sure as much as possible to surround yourself with positivity. I know that there will be a tendency to let this crisis get you down, especially as we're isolated, and I think this is we need to fight against this, and as much as possible make sure that your voice is raised through whatever venue that you have at your disposal, be it newspaper op-eds, be it on the streets. Make sure that we can remember that you do have the possibility of influencing policy, as long as you can maintain your positive spirit and your fighting spirit.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Over to you, Betty.
Sure. Just building on Sarah's words, I mean, I think my only advice would be, we are fighters and we shouldn't give up. These are difficult times. None of us young people have gone through something like this, but we are adaptable and we are resilient and we are agents of change. And we should believe in that. If there is difficulty, let's seek support. There are opportunities, there are options. We really just need to go and seek the help we need. But I think we are going to build back better, and we just need to believe it.
Great, thank you so much, Betty, and thank you so much, Sarah. As a young person, I'm listening to this and I feel so inspired and so positive and so happy. And you're right, I think in situations like this, you know, young people are really leaders and agents of change, and it's about believing in that power that you have, and also having government, civil society, and sort of come together to really support and enable young people. And I think that's all that we can do sort of at this stage. So thank you again to Betty and Sarah for your powerful messages. It has been a pleasure having you in this event. So we are now moving on to the next section and into a deep dive on education and mental well-being. I would like to once again invite Drew to take us through the main findings in this regard. So over to you, Drew.
Excellent. Thanks once again, Cici, and very, very interesting discussion. Thanks for the previous panelists and Sarah especially. So I think for me, we did have a module on education and training, and also talk a little bit about mental well-being. And for me, I think, and for many people, these were the most interesting but also devastating findings of this survey. And I think they come at a very important time, because schools will very shortly, students will very shortly go back to school, and governments, education institutions, and others are now planning for the restarting of this next fall semester. And some countries have, and education institutions have chosen to remain with distance learning. Others will have face-to-face learning, and there's all types of different solutions being proposed. But indeed, closing schools was the easy part. Reopening them is proving to be much more difficult, and I think much more important. We did see in our survey that over 70% of young people were affected by school closures. So it was across the globe. But this affected different countries and different students in different ways. And most of that was due to how large the digital divide was. No, so do countries and schools have the infrastructure, but also the connectivity to offer those types of learning? And that's where we saw big differences between high income and low income countries. So in an aggregate, in addition to schools being closed, 1 in 8 young people's learning stopped completely. So they weren't receiving any types of classes or learning. There was, 1 in 6 of young people saw their education and training come to a full stop. Sorry, not 1 in 8. And indeed, as I said, high income countries could somehow rely on the digital, on digital ways of learning, and others not, right? And actually the differences were quite huge. So 65% were learning less, and 3 out of 5 young people report that their education may be delayed or fail, right? So actually, I think this number of mentioning that young people would fail was somewhere around 9% of young people thought that their education would totally fail. So this is kind of the main findings, and as Susanna mentioned in the outset, the difference between other crises with the current crisis of the COVID pandemic is that there's both effects on the demand side, so the jobs that are being created, but also on the supply side. And the risk that we're facing now is that there'll be a lifelong scar on these young people because they're not able to go to school or because their education will be delayed. And the scarring will be on their future wages, their future income potential, and their future jobs. Another very interesting finding, if we can move to the next slide, is the effect on young people's mental well-being. So we know that at the outset, young people were already more affected by psychological issues and lower levels of mental health and mental well-being. Depression, but also suicide, is more prevalent among young people initially. So going into that, those were already the issues. And actually, what we did find in the survey was devastating, really. So we found that over half of young people may be showing signs of anxiety and depression, and that 1 out of 6 young people are most likely, so they're probably affected by anxiety or depression. Psychological problems or issues are also found to be more prevalent amongst younger youth, so there's an age correlation here, and also more prevalent amongst young women. And this could be a result of increased domestic burdens, childcare burdens, given that a lot of isolation measures, working from home measures were put in place. This puts pressures on the home and creates a stress at home, not only in work, but in everyday life. There was some positive aspects here. I should say positive, some coping mechanisms. So in fact, young people that were allowed to remain in education or in work did have lower levels of effects of their mental well-being. So it seems the ability to work and to study did offset, some of these mental health issues, which I think is for us in particular at the ILO is an important part. But these are, what we've seen is that there is mental health issues as a result of the pandemic. They did exist before, and they're being exacerbated now. And I think it's a baseline issue that is something that needs to also be dealt with and managed, together with our partners and working on issues like counseling, for there to be then longer term positive benefits on work and education. I'll leave it there, Cici. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Drew. And I think what you said about especially how COVID has sort of widened that sort of digital divide with education really resonates. And I think as well, looking at how we can mitigate some of those socioeconomic impacts and how we can also reduce the burden of young people whose schooling, whose training have also been affected, and those compounded effects on their mental health as well. So just a quick reminder to our audience as well, please feel free to use the Q&A function in the Zoom chat to also ask questions for our panelists, particularly on this session on education and mental well-being. So let me bring in our panelists, Franco and Srinivas. Welcome to the both of you and to this event. So let's start with Franco first. The closure of schools and training institutions, as Drew has illustrated, have led to lower levels of learning, but also deprived young people of social contact with tangible consequences to their mental well-being. Could you please share with us your experience and that of other young ISEC trainees and students from across the globe? Over to you.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much, Cici, for your question. It is very, I would say, aligning and relatable to me and to us as ISEC, what you just mentioned. And I want to start off saying and taking a little bit of the presentation that Drew did, and one of the facts, which is like 1 out of 6 people currently are battling different feelings that are more leaning towards tiredness, depression, and so on and so forth. And for us, leading a network of 40,000 volunteers all over the world has been quite challenging in these specific contexts, because we've seen how the motivation, how the eagerness of our people has been reduced over time since the pandemic lockdown has started, right? And I think for us, the main challenge has been, how can we support these people now that their work, like their education, everything has been, let's say, transformed in a completely different way of what they used to know into a new normal reality? How can we equip, how can we skill up, how can we provide resources for these young people in order to be more able to not only get through, but actually face and break through what they're going right now in order to face a new different world? And I think that our efforts and a lot of the efforts that we've been doing with our partners has been based or try to focus on how can we reinvent, how can we pivot the way we manage young people as a young people organization also. How can we, let's say, reimagine what leading volunteers, reimagine how leading young people, engage young people has been during these times. So I think like for us as an organization that focused on not only achieving peace and fulfillment of community's potential, but also providing skills or non-formal education to young people, it has been a lot of like reinventing our digital events, reinventing our virtual engagements, reinventing the kind of content that we put out there for our members, our volunteers, our trainees, and that it can be still relevant for them. Because I think that's the play field we're having right now, where nothing is as it used to be for us and for any organization, I think so. And the constant challenge lies there. If we are facing these facts, if we're facing these facts, how can we provide young people a better environment and better tools for them to not only, as I said, get through this pandemic or this new normal, but actually break through and feel energized or like feel that they can actually cope with it. And I think we play as non-formal education organizations a huge role there.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Franco. And I think what you said about sort of reimagining a lot of what we do, whether it's training young people, whether it's doing skills development and reimagining what we think volunteerism is so important in this day and age. Let me bring Srinivas into the conversation as well. So Srinivas, COVID-19 has put in evidence, again, that sharp digital divide across regions. From a policy perspective, how can we ensure quality and continuity of education and skills development in these difficult times when young people more than ever need a safe and certain transition to decent work?
Thank you, Cici. As the previous panelists have highlighted some of the major sharp differences, COVID-19 has not spared anybody, any country in the world and any person, no matter where we are and what level of development we are in. But the digital divide has also come to a sharp attention now. As Drew has shown the results, while a large number of people have been able to um, switch to online learning or digital ways of working, 65% in high-income countries, 55% young people in middle-income countries, but a sharp decline, 18% in the low-income countries or the least developed countries. So as many as 88% of young people in low-income countries do not have access to any kind of online learning. When we look deeper, many of these young people do not have access to or cannot afford even basic digital equipment like a smartphone or a laptop or a computer or a desktop, or even buying the bandwidth. They cannot afford the bandwidth. And therefore, as an individual, as a young person, is at a double or triple disadvantage. And by virtue of their location and level of development of that country, the skills development infrastructure and the digital infrastructure in the schools and technical and vocational education institutions is even adding to the disadvantage. The schools do not have that digital infrastructure, and the teachers and trainers are not equipped to handle the digital way of learning. In a number of LDCs, they simply, even the teachers, trainers, managers, they do not know how to handle this online and distance learning. While online and distance learning is not the only solution, but when the COVID pandemic has opened up, this kind of an opportunity for a lot of young people to be able to switch to online learning, I think we need to really enable this access to people in all parts of the world, in all regions, no matter whatever is the level of development, as a matter of right, actually, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of right. Every young person walking this earth should have access to basic digital infrastructure and basic opportunities to improve their skill and acquire a skill. I think this is a sense of urgency has to be now felt in all the member states, in all the countries. How can we empower the young people with the necessary access?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Srinivas. And I think especially what you said about how sort of bridging that digital divide is a matter of human rights. It's a matter of rights, not just an issue of development. So thank you so much for that. Let's move now to the Q&A and hear from our audience. Another reminder to our audience, please take this time, if you haven't done so already, to use the Q&A function to ask your questions. When submitting your questions, do let us know if you would like to ask them live, in which case, please be ready to present, speak up, and state your name and country. So while we are gathering questions for our panelists, we would love to hear from our audience on what you think via the third poll, which is, I think, being loaded now. So the third poll will be on mental well-being and education, particularly during the COVID-19 period. So I'll just give a little bit of time for the poll to be loaded up, and then we will continue shortly. Great. So let me turn back to our panelists and bring sort of two questions from our audience. The first question is from Arabella, and she asks, how can we ensure interns as youth and often in education are supported? She's referring to the issue of sort of unpaid internships and how we can ensure decent work for unpaid interns. The second question is from Paul Park from South Korea. Paul asks, mental health and in general is a taboo in South Korea, making it harder to seek help. What would you recommend to people to do in this situation? I will also invite Yusuf, who has raised their hands at the moment. Yusuf, I will now give the floor to you to ask your questions directly to our panelists. So over to you, Yusuf.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Yusuf Muhammad Zango. What I'm trying to say right now, or I should say, we are talking about education and unemployment to the youth. I mean, amid this COVID-19 situation that we have. So all I have to say is not something big or something much. Is that just like here in Africa, we have bad governance. First of all, the government didn't even give us the right and the ability to have a good education, to be employed. We'll be seeking employment. We'll be following them as if they are our God, like that. After all, they were elected by us. And the first thing that we have, actually, even just right now here in Africa, should I specifically say in my country, Nigeria, the richest man in Africa, who is Alhaji Aliko Dangote, just sacked 6,000 of his staffs amid this COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, you see, this one too will bring this is all will bring an impact also to this COVID-19 situation, and will bring a lot of depression, anxiety, and other things to the youth. As for all of the staff sacked out of the 10,000, 90% of them are youth, and they belong to the African continent, not any other continent, and specifically even the country is Nigeria. So I don't know how we are going to cope with this or something like that.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your question. Let me bring it back to our panelists, and I'll start first with Franco. There's quite a lot of questions, so please feel free to pick a few. Do share us sort of your thoughts and insights. So over to you, Franco.
Perfect. I would love to actually answer to Paul's question, especially because what he mentioned is very important, right? In some countries, in some territories where we operate as an organization, we have realized and we've seen how young people are still, let's say, they're still far away from to ask help when it comes to mental health because of the taboos or because of like the concepts that are around that currently is still in our society. And the question is, how can we actually, or what do we recommend for people in this situation? I would have to say that's something we've been trying to encourage lately a lot into our network volunteers, since even getting mental health help right now, it's moving to an online way, let's say, channel. There are several pages, apps, or platforms where you can actually get some mental health support, such as, like, I don't know, Talkspace, BetterHelp, where you break this taboo, you break this like kind of, let's say, mystery around mental health support, and you can do it in a very discreet, in a very in a way that you can feel very comfortable. And I think that from our experience seeing how this has impacted our volunteers, our main advice here is to take the first step. Sometimes taking the first step and breaking these concepts, these constructs that we have about getting help in the mental side, we see it as something complicated. But if we take that first step and we kind of use the channels, or like the way the mental health side has also been transformed with digital transformation and everything that is happening currently in this new normal world, we are going to see, or we're going to find different options that can actually help you to tackle these issues inside of putting them aside, which is something that sometimes we do. And also we do it because of the pressure that we can see from society, or the taboos that we can find in our own environments.
Great. Thank you so much, Franco. And I think that's why the report is so great, because the report also recommends looking into the complementaries between education, employment interventions, also with psychosocial support, and also with sports. And I think what Drew said as well is that sometimes when young people are still in employment, that can sort of help offset some of those mental health risks as well. So turning over to Srinivas as well, for some of your thoughts. Do you sort of agree with what Franco's saying? How can we help young people to really sort of take that first step? So over to you, Srinivas.
Thank you, Cici. Also, I agree with Franco. How can we also empower young people? One of the major challenges in terms of really supporting young people is the transition. The first job, acquiring the first job, because every employer wants to have experienced people. What is your experience? Employers would ask, but how to get that first experience to become experienced. And this relates to the question also, friend has raised about internships, unpaid internships, and lack of opportunities for internships. We strongly believe at the ILO, to address this COVID pandemic, First of all, investments need to be upscaled in job creation. That's fundamental. Job creation, member states, governments have to step up investment in creating jobs as a first step. And then this is also the time to increase investment in skilling people, getting people ready to be able to, access those jobs. So particularly for young people, how to enable acquiring that first experience. And in that dimension, I think it's very important to provide opportunities for internships and work, various forms of work-based learning, apprenticeships and traineeships and learnerships and sometimes volunteering. This is very, very important. We at the ILO, for example, we stand as an example by providing stipends to interns and internships. International Labour Conference in the years 2022 and 2023 will precisely address this issue of developing an international standard on apprenticeships. We hope that the government's employees and workers organizations will look into some of these issues and provide a comprehensive global guidance on how apprenticeships and work-based learning can be improved and standardized, which becomes a guidance for the enterprises and people seeking work experience, and also the governments to promote.
Great, thank you so much, Srinivas. And I'd also just like to turn your attention to the results of our third poll on education and mental well-being. And I think a lot of our audience sort of really agrees with what's being said, especially, when talking about sort of unpaid internships and jobs in general. 32% of our respondents are saying that the uncertainty of career prospects is really triggering sort of and inducing those anxiety and depressive feelings among students. And also the social isolation that comes with the closing of schools, as Drew sort of mentioned earlier as well. Closing schools is the easy part. What we're finding right now is really the difficulty when it comes to reopening schools and sort of the challenges surrounding that. I mean, 1 in 6 young people have stopped schooling entirely. So how can we support those young people, particularly in sort of the most vulnerable in rural and sort of remote areas as well? So thank you very much both for your answers to these questions. So moving on to the last part, which is of course the key takeaways. So to both of you, in 1 minute or less, what is your key takeaway? What is your message to young people whose education and skills development has been affected by the pandemic? And for this, I will start and bring the mic over to Srinivas first. So over to you.
Thank you, Sissy. My advice would be for young people to cope up with these challenging situations, to pay more attention to improving the core skills for life and employability. For example, the 4 C's, communication, creativity and innovation, collaboration and critical thinking are continuing to be very, very relevant. Adding to these 4 C's is the adaptability and digital skills. So if you pay more attention to these core skills, which are transferable, you can change occupation, you are willing to learn a new thing, you are ready to adapt. So the more you invest in core skills, that will help you in your life and work, the more you will become ready to be employable and pay attention to that transition.
Great, thank you so much, Srinivas. Over to you, Franco.
I definitely like to also it resonates what Srinivas just shared with us, also with me, and definitely right now I think it's a great time to start checking what are all the resources available for us to become more, let's say, skill up ourselves, skill up our knowledge, and see what are those kind of like abilities that we need to be building right now. This time is great to start like looking in that. There's a lot of organizations that are putting in their content materials that young people can take a lot of advantage on. But something that I would like to add on top of that is a call to action for young people, especially right now, is to create community, create these bonds, create these spaces where more you can like activate more young people, you can gather more young people and discuss some of these topics. Because right now, I think there's a lot of people that they feel like they're going through this whole change in the world by themselves. But if we create community, if we create a support system for more young people to understand that they're not alone in this, and that we together can skill up ourselves, we together can figure out and work for their future, that definitely brings hope for young people to keep pushing, to keep working, and what I was saying in the very beginning, to break through to what we're going right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Franco. And thank you so much, Srinivas, as well. I think you're exactly right, sort of young people taking charge and sort of leading the way while the pandemic sort of presents tremendous challenges that we have to face. It really presents a unique opportunity for young people to really lead the way, whether that is sort of upskilling and helping other young people, but also look at how we can build that community and how we can rethink and reimagine ways of doing things as well. So thank you so much to both for participating in the event, and it's been an absolute pleasure. We're now moving on to the last segment and the last panel discussion on youth rights and activism. So I once again invite Drew to take us through the main findings. So the floor is yours, Drew.
Great, thanks again. This is the last segment that I'll present on the survey. I understand my microphone might have had some issues the last time, CC. So can you just give me a hand or let me know if you can hear me okay now?
In and out. So if you could just stay closer to the mic. Yep.
I'll try. How's this? Is that a bit better?
Yes, this is great.
Okay, excellent. So this is an area of our results where we do see some sunshine through the clouds. You know, young people especially at the beginning of the pandemic, but it continues, have been the brunt of some, I'd say, negative press when it comes to respecting some of the measures which have been put in place. You know, from everything from wearing a mask to maintaining the social distancing to other issues. So what our survey found is that this was not the case. This was not the case. Young people did respect and adhere to the measures. So 80% of young people did stay at home during this crisis period. And other measures as well that we found, including helping others and showing levels of volunteerism and donations. So on the volunteerism issues, we did find that 1 in 3 young people did do some form of volunteering, whether that be helping older people, bringing groceries, doing stuff online to help others, and also 27. So over a quarter of young people also donated to charitable organizations, which is actually quite huge when you think about it. 1 in 4 young people were doing some charitable donations. So I think this proves the point that, you know, although there is different groups that would have trouble respecting some of the measures that have been put in place, overall young people are not anymore not respecting these issues than other groups are. We also had some open-ended questions in our survey, which asked people to provide examples of how they were helping others or volunteering. And some very interesting examples came up. I think one of the most interesting examples was the issue of combating false news and misinformation. So there is a lot of misinformation about the virus, which is coming out. And young people, I think, recognized this very early on and provided a lot of support and work online to try to combat some of that misinformation. Another area that we looked into in the survey was the issue of rights, and in particular, human rights. Now, this was a bit of a delicate area to look into because, as we probably all know, there was some areas of people's and young people, in particular human rights, which were unavoidably affected by lockdown and stay-at-home measures. I mean, we couldn't go out of our houses. So, you know, the right to freedom of movement was obviously and unavoidably affected. If I can just ask Susanna or whoever's controlling the PowerPoint to go to the next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. So we looked at 8 different areas of rights: the right to leisure, to to participation in public affairs, the right to freedom of religion and belief, the right to information, the right to privacy, housing, safety, and then the right to legal support. So indeed, we did find that 1 in 3 young people noticed a significant impact on their right to participate in public affairs. We highlight this one because it's a big one. You know, young people already have difficulty participating in decision-making bodies, in other issues that affect, you know, their everyday living and their right to the labor market, their right to jobs. So I think the pandemic has definitely increased that. 27% also experience impacts to the right to freedom of religion. This we saw more affected in low-income countries, and indeed, many religious institutions and churches were closed. You know, so how do you then access your right to freedom of religion when some of those traditional avenues are closed? We did find that different subgroups of youth were affected in different ways, and actually minority groups did have their rights affected more than other groups. And you can make various estimates and predictions of why this was the case. And the misinformation and fake news, I mentioned that in the previous slide, affected the right to access information for 1 in 4 youth, but also was the fact that given many public services were closed down, or at least had limited capacity, they were less available to respond to young people's requests for information and about COVID and about other areas that might affect their lives.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Drew, for the presentation. So let me just bring also back to our audience as well. So please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. Please also let us know if you would like to ask your question live, and please be prepared to do so as well. So let me bring in our panelists for this round, Giovanna and Todd. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us today. So let me start with Giovanna. Young people across the globe continue to experience the challenges inherent with the lockdown measures, sort of as demonstrated by Drew and the findings of the survey, particularly on the economic consequences. In your opinion, how are European youth faring as regards to the rights, regards the impacts on their rights? Over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm really very happy to participate on this very important day for youth. And I'm really very happy that we are facing the new updates on the situation, which is currently facing all over the world and has very big impacts on young people. So we all survived actually the times of the lockdown, where a lot of our regular rights, which we were used to, were in a crisis. And this is something that made us think about the basic things that we actually had the opportunity to do in the regular times, like to travel, to be active, to participate, to have the freedom of movement, the freedom of the access to some right informations. Now all of these things have been put in risk, and this is something that we are all facing all over the world. So it's globally, and basically this is something that's tackling all of us in different communities, but also having in fact that we live in different conditions. These impacts are being slightly different in different countries. So basically all the measures that we survived during the COVID time had influenced different kinds of aspects of young people's life, not only from the economical side, like the loss of jobs or the very new difficulties in adapting to the conditions we are living in, but also in the terms of the human rights, which are being affected quite a lot. And basically all the young people who were already in some disadvantaged positions in the regular times are now facing even more difficulties in the times we are now living. So basically, not only the fact that we are having many fake news where young people show their very important role in fighting against the lack of information and the relevant information about the pandemics, but we also faced in many countries the democracy who was put into the quarantine as well, in the terms of fighting against the coronavirus and actually the fight for the public health. So basically, these are some of the things we have to consider, and where young people are really facing lots of issues concerning the human rights, the social rights, and inequalities they're facing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Giovanna. And I think what you said, especially about how sort of young people in the spaces in which they can really participate in public life, and sort of the spaces in which they can voice their opinions, are shrinking, especially with COVID. And it's really important that we protect those spaces and we protect the rights of young people. So let me also turn now to our poll for our audience members. So the last poll on rights and social activism is up and running now. So please feel free to vote and we'll share the results of that poll later. Now let's move to Todd. So Todd, as the pandemic continues and we start perceiving the dangers of new waves, how can we protect young people's rights while ensuring their voices and activism are heard and amplified? Over to you, Todd.
Well, thanks, Cisse, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you today. That's a really difficult question you gave me. Today, COVID-19 perhaps presents one of the greatest threats to human rights that we've seen in our collective lifetimes. And why is it a difficult question? Because the pandemic affects people in different ways. If we're looking at, for example, some youth that has a vulnerable condition, their right to health is very important to them. And so they're looking at it from that perspective. While others may be, having difficulty with work, yet others with education, and others again with activism in terms of assembly and speech. And so it affects so many rights and affects it in so many different ways. And then on top of that, we have a problem in terms of, scientific knowledge is developing. It's a new thing, this virus. And so what are the appropriate boundaries in terms of rights and activities is something that we need to define over time. We're learning as we're going along. And then of course we have the problem of certain governments take advantage or instrumentalize the crisis to curtail rights, while other governments haven't taken the virus seriously enough and have jeopardized the rights of their own citizens by failing to have people understand that their actions affect others. So it's super complex. Oh, you've already spoken about the right to work, education, mental health. I think we'll focus more in this particular one on rights like participation, assembly, because these are also very relevant. And I think what we find is that, if we look at the pandemic, we're seeing that marginalized groups are often suffering greater impact. Now, why is that? Because the virus doesn't discriminate, but societies do. And so if there are inequalities in terms of access to healthcare, access to work, access to water, all of these things will impact the impact of the virus on those people. And then we had a phenomenon going on directly before COVID. I mean, globally, we saw people out in the streets protesting various injustices, inequalities related to access to higher education, related to access to work, related to marginalizations of many kinds. But we also see that people under 30 represent only 2% of the parliamentarians today. So this large segment of the population is looking for an outlet in terms of how do they express them? How do they actually make real this idea that they need to participate or can participate in decisions affecting them? And so that's why I think we've seen a very large response in the survey in terms of 1/3 saying that their right to participate in public affairs has been affected, including peaceful protests. because for them, they don't have representation in parliaments. And for them, they need to find a way, an outlet, in terms of how do they do that. And the virtual space exists, but it has limitations in terms of participation in government decisions affecting them. And secondly, you have a problem in terms of access. I mean, certain youth don't have access and don't have the development of that capacity in terms of protest and participation online. Human rights law guarantees that individuals affected by a government decision have an ability to participate in that decision. And I think it's been hard for governments to change overnight from having in-person meetings to virtual meetings. And so it's not always, that the government's like, oh, this is great, we're going to limit. But it's actually just a fact that it's hard to change. Obviously, governments have emergency powers, legislative powers, executive powers that can be used to promote and protect human rights, like the right to health, the right to livelihoods. But of course, those limitations need to be done in a balanced way, looking at the risks, and they need to be proportionate, to the public good they're trying to do. And so these are all things happening all at one time. And so that may understand, or that may give us a reason for understanding why the people who responded to the poll, 68% said that their right to leisure has been impacted. And I was puzzled by this. I was like, well, why is that? Why does people see that as the most important? And then I thought, well, you know what? Maybe this is a group of active people.
Yeah.
It's not that they were saying, hey, I couldn't go out and go to a movie or a bar, or I couldn't ride my bike. No, is that they were working more because the COVID crisis is actually creating more work for the activist community. How do you actually participate at this moment? How do you retool? How do you actually respond in a way so that you're not losing the political space that you've gained and actually augmenting? And so it is interesting to see that. Of course, I'm speculating, but it is interesting. And then I just think, I think too, just looking at a couple more of those statistics, right? It also would be consistent to say that people were impacted because they were working more. And secondly, the thing is that, isolation affects mental health. I was able to listen in a little bit to the last panel. I mean, we're social beings, and the way we socialize has been affected. Exactly, and I can see how people feel very, very, very much touched by it. 66% people said they reached out to loved ones and whatnot. That's great.
I know, it definitely. Thank you so much, Todd. I think you've raised sort of a lot of great points, and about it's really important that we sort of balance everything. And different rights do mean a lot to different people, depending on how you're affected and the way in which you're affected. So let's move now also to our Q&A and hear from our audience one last time. Just a reminder to our audience again to please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. And also we'll be calling on people who have raised their hands to ask the question live. So be prepared and ready for that. So we've received quite a number of questions from our audience. The first one is from Omar from India, who asks on the issue of rights at work. He asks, how are we going to stop this unethical practice of exploiting young talents by the job givers, whether in terms of long working hours or taking undue advantage of talented graduates, of the organizations behind the curtain of COVID-19 in the name of giving jobs? The second question that we have is from Aline Alonso, who is asking about access to internet, technology, and electricity. Do you believe that access to internet should be a right to all youth? How can we accelerate advocacy in this direction? Before we continue as well, let me also just take the floor to one of our live audience members. So to Joyce, I will now give the floor to you to ask our panelists a live question. Over to you, Joyce.
Okay, hello. Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me clearly.
Go ahead, Joyce.
My name is Joyce Wanjiro, and I am the current Miss Kibera. And basically, for us, I'm also the founder of Beyond the Scars CBO, which is a program that is helping vulnerable people in our community. And as you all know, Kibera is one big place, and a lot of people did not really accept and see like COVID is real. So whatever we are doing is we are sensitizing the community on a daily basis, telling them the importance of wearing their masks, keeping social distance, and also maintaining all the guidelines that the government has put in place. So mine is just to say that it is important that we continue to sensitize and also to look for ways that we are going to mitigate this COVID and ensure that if at all it is possible, then most of the people are not going to be affected by this pandemic. You realize that in other countries, like we are seeing, a lot of people have really lost their lives, others have lost their livelihoods. But for us here, I realize that most people are seeing like this disease is not existing. And most of them are like, if we are staying like 10 in a house, a single house, how are we going to put the social distance? If you cannot be able to put food on the table, how are we going to buy masks and wear the mask? So for us, as the founder of Beyond the Scars, what I've been doing is I have looked for well-wishers that we keep on donating masks, we keep on looking for vulnerable families and distributing food for vulnerable families. But you realize even if you do that, most of them have lost their livelihoods. So even
Hello.
Tomorrow, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes. No, thank you so much, Joyce. And thank you for sort of shining a light on sort of your local situation as well. I think sort of as you've said, you know, it's really about sort of raising awareness and sort of protecting the community. And I think, you know, there are always examples, as Todd sort of mentioned, where you know, the governments aren't taking it seriously, but there are also really great examples of governments stepping up and ensuring that people's rights are protected, and also sort of creating those spaces, enabling those spaces for people to sort of raise awareness. So in the interest of time, we've got lots of questions for both our panelists. Let me turn to Giovanna first for your thoughts and for your insights. Over to you, Giovanna.
Thanks a lot. Well, I will tackle first of all the question about internet, because I think that now more than ever we understand the value of the quality network, and I can really say that internet is now the basic human right. And this is something we should, of course, all advocate to make all young people, but all over the world, to have the access to the network, because it's something which is now very important, not only for jobs, but also for educational matters, but also for the activism, which is now put it on the networks more than it was, more than ever before. So from this sense, I really think that our priority should be to advocate for the decent quality network all over the world for young people, and this is something which is a new human right. The other thing, thanks to very much, Joyce, for emphasizing the question. I can also build up on that, since the fact that I'm a medical doctor as well next to my activism. So I really want to make a big emphasis on the importance of respecting the protective measures, and I think that young people have a very important role, and they are the ones who could make a new dimension in this. So it means that wearing the protective mask could be also a very nice way to, for instance, for young artists to make some kind of unique masks which will be reusable. This is the space for young people who are very active in different designing works to have their opportunity to show their impact as well, but also to just all the time think that the virus is here, we are living with it, and we should be quite responsible in all the things we are doing, and be the one who will give our personal example to the others how we should fight the virus as well, next to the other things or consequences he is living on our everyday life.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Giovanna. I'll take the questions now over to Todd. Unfortunately, these questions haven't gotten any easier, but what are some of your thoughts and insights? Over to you.
You know, I think that first and foremost, what we've seen from the response to COVID is that certain governments have taken the rights of their citizens seriously, and they tend to have had a better response. And that while not always in every aspect, but if you look, for example, at South Africa, they recognized right away that there was going to be a problem in terms of internet access, and that they tried to bring down the fees for internet access because the right to livelihood would be affected if people didn't have that access. You've also seen, like, for example, in Vietnam, where let's say the GDP per person is so much, you know, it isn't that significant compared to some of the more developed countries. But the mechanisms they put in place to protect the right to health and livelihood at an early moment were very important to reduce the prevalence of the disease. And I think that one of the things that would be very useful for youth today in terms of when they're talking about engaging in the response is that there's good practices in many places, but there isn't always the information flow. There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of politicization relative to information. And so how do you actually bring those good practices that show that even in low income circumstances, there have been creative responses by the community, sometimes with the help of government, sometimes government. And so it is really important to understand what's happening in different parts of the world and learn from it, so that we actually create a response to COVID that enhances rights and limits these limitations that we've seen in other places where we've seen an instrumentalization of the virus in order to limit the participation, which is so much needed to create dynamic and right perspective.
Definitely. Definitely. Thank you so much, Todd. And I guess while I have you as well, you know, both of you actually, I think, you know, what you said about sort of boosting the youth voice, especially in policy as well, really resonated well with our audience in our last poll on how sort of the voice of young people and social activism can actually be channeled during this difficult time. So Todd, what are your key takeaways in 1 minute or less? What is your key message to young people whose rights have been affected by the pandemic?
You know, first and foremost, Cisse, I would say that in all problems, there's opportunities. And that this crisis is enormous. And that if the youth manage to overcome what they're facing, they'll build an important skill set for resilience, and they'll be capable of dealing with other crises in the future. And that's what we need as a society. The young people are the future. That's not cliche, that's a reality. Human rights are tools, they're not gifts. People need to understand how to use them to help facilitate the changes that they seek. And finally, you know, don't underestimate yourself. We need your help, your efforts, your activism to help build a better society. That's globally, locally, nationally, and that through their work, through their involvement, they can really make sure that when we build back better, we're talking about the inclusion of all voices, including youth. Thanks very much, Cisse.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Todd. Over to you, Giovanna.
Well, for the conclusion, we are all aware of the fact the times we are living in, but I also think that this is a great opportunity to maybe use new tools. We already discussed about the usage of internet. I think that young people should continue being active and should continue fighting for their rights in the new conditions we are living. I'm absolutely sure that we will be more present for our voluntary jobs for our communities, because we are living in the times where others are also needing our help. And this is the right way for young people to continue being active in this sense as well. And I also think this is a very good time to reflect on ourselves, our lives, to be strong, to be solidar, and to continue working on very important issues. These are the rights of young people all over the world.
Great. Thank you so much, Shavana, and thank you so much, Todd, sort of for your inspiring words. And it's a really nice note to sort of end our webinar. And thank you to all of our panelists for an incredible discussion. Before we finish, let me pass it over to Susanna once more for some closing remarks. Over to you, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Cici, and thank you everybody for the active participation. Unless urgent action is taken, young people are likely to suffer severe and long-lasting impacts from the pandemic. We believe that there is a genuine risk of long-term scarring effects, and we invite you to work with us because together then we can protect and ensure that the transition of young people to productive employment and decent work is a reality. So with this, I thank you again for joining, and please check the report. It is already the link. It is in the box chat. We look forward to your feedback, to your dissemination, to your contributions, and we thank you for your voices and as well as the support of all the partners. Cici, thank you for your moderation, and to the whole team for the preparation of this webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, Susanna. And from the organising team at Decent Jobs for Youth, we wish you a happy International Youth Day and hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye for now.